It's a pleasure to be here with you today at the first Jordanian conference, and thank you for the invitation. Just very briefly, I'd like to acknowledge the members of the Safety Centre, because without their membership, we could not do the work that we do. And we also work with a lot of universities around the world, and that is very important to try and improve education for the future as well. What I want to talk about today is all about the human element of process safety. And you'll see the framework I have here on the screen is all about that human element. So leadership is the core part of it, and there are other things that are important, but human factors is there and very, very important. And it is something we need to continually work on to make sure that we address human factors issues. And the challenge we have is that sometimes humans make mistakes, and we will continue to make mistakes. What we need to do is make sure those mistakes don't cause an incident. And as Trevor Kletz once said, for a long time, people were saying that most accidents were due to human error. And this is true in a sense, but it's not very helpful. It's a bit like saying falls are due to gravity. So humans will make mistakes. We need to accept that. We need to make sure our systems are resilient to cope with those mistakes. So if we think about the human side, we adapt to the environment that we're in all the time. But that means we become used to what we see, and we don't always see when something is wrong if we're used to seeing it. And this is what we call normalization of deviance. And I would like to talk to you about normalization of deviance and give you an example of an incident where that occurred. So what is normalization of deviance? Basically, this is where we stop seeing what is going wrong. We don't notice the small little thing that has changed. Tiny changes happen all the time. And sometimes they lead to an incident if we don't notice them. So sometimes we talk about it's useful to see a cold eyes review of something, or fresh eyes. We want someone else to take a look at something. This is so that we can try and avoid the normalization of deviance that we might see. The case study I'm going to talk about today is actually nothing to do with traditional process safety. I want to talk about a space shuttle, the Columbia space shuttle, in fact. Now, on the 1st of February, 2003, the Columbia space shuttle disintegrated, broke up, coming back into Earth's orbit after its mission in space. And all 7 astronauts died on that mission. During the launch, a bit of foam came off one of the tanks and hit the wing. This caused damage to the wing, and it damaged what's called the heat shield, the thermal reinforced carbon-carbon shield. And this led to the overheating in the wing, which caused it to disintegrate. If we look at the history of NASA's space shuttle launches, the important thing here is from the normalization of deviance, what we notice is there is a lot of evidence of debris or foam hitting the shuttle on launch. There was a long list of incidents where it had happened. And in fact, this one that's highlighted here was a substantial impact that occurred. There was a near burn through. So the shuttle almost didn't make it back to Earth, but it did land. And so people decided that the shuttle was very strong. It wasn't going to have a problem. So they became more used to the idea that foam strikes were okay. It was no longer a deviance. It was no longer a problem. It was normal. It was just what happened. So if we think about the history of how that happened, there was a lot of history of incidents where the shuttle got hit. There was very little work done to try and learn how to fix a tile if it got damaged, though. So they couldn't have fixed the tile even if they knew it was damaged. And there was some history of the tiles being broken and causing safety issues for them. So this just shows you a picture of the space shuttle, and what you can see is where the spit-circled bipod ramp, that's where the foam came from when the shuttle separated from the tank. That's where the damage came from. We need to understand a little bit of history as to why this created a problem though. So after the Apollo missions, NASA in the US decided they wanted reusable spacecraft. So the design was so these spacecraft could do 50 flights a year. But at the best, they only ever got 24 flights, and it cost more than they anticipated. This became a problem for them because it was not delivering the expected outcome they were after. And the fact was, the shuttle was still being continually modified all the way through its life. If we look at the history of normalization that we have, as I said, there were previous incidents, but the one that they are most known for prior to Columbia was the Challenger space shuttle. In this instance, the Challenger space shuttle disintegrated on launch. And that was because, again, normalization of deviance occurred with an O-ring problem in their solid rocket boosters. The engineers didn't want to launch that day because they were worried about the O-rings, but they had no evidence to suggest it was really a problem. So the launch went ahead, and an investigation found that the engineers had been overruled in this instance. If we look at what changed after Challenger happened, so there were a lot of changes made to the structure, the organization in NASA to try and prevent this normalization of deviance occurring and the cultural issues that they found. But they didn't change the part of NASA that managed human spaceflight, where the shuttles were. So they didn't actually change the part where they were having the problem. So by the time it came to launch Columbia, they had not learnt the lessons of Challenger. They had just not learned. It's interesting when we think about what the change was, what the small creeping change was that occurred. So there was a design requirement that no debris, no foam broke off anything on launch, but they couldn't achieve that. So they started to just accept it. The fact that they were able to return to Earth without problems, they assumed it was all okay, rather than focusing on maybe it not being okay. With the debris strike, they had actually normalized it to the point that it was a no safety of flight issue. It was an acceptable risk. There was no safety issue at all. They had discounted the idea that there was ever going to be a problem. And there were 7 instances of major foam strikes that occurred. And so this became a problem for them, but they just kept justifying that it was okay. So think about your facilities here. How many times do you have a near miss on something? The incident doesn't quite happen. You need to learn from that, not think, well, the incident didn't happen, this is good. It is good the incident didn't happen, but the fact is it could easily still happen if you're having the near miss. So what can you do to notice what we call these weak signals and prevent them becoming a problem? There was one major debris strike that occurred before Columbia though, and it was a big near miss, a very big near miss. It was on Atlantis and it damaged the heat shield. And when Atlantis landed, its wing had almost burnt through, but they managed to land okay. They celebrated this as a success because they landed and it was great. What that did was reinforce to people that they could land with foam strikes. It was not a problem anymore. This reinforced the normalization of deviance. And this is actually a photo of Atlantis after its last flight. And you can see here that the tiles are damaged from the flight as well. And that continued to happen on every flight that took place. when we look at what happened with Columbia, they did a review after launch, as they do every launch. They look at what happened. They look at the video, they look at the photos. But whilst they saw something hit the shuttle, they saw the foam hit the space shuttle, they didn't think it was going to be a problem. They were concerned about the damage, and the engineers asked for more detailed photos, but they weren't able to get them. And so this meant they couldn't tell the damage that had occurred to the space shuttle. Something else that occurs in normalization of deviance, though. Columbia was 22 years old when this incident happened. It was the oldest of all the space shuttles. It was the first one built. And it had a lot of instruments and gauges and measurement devices inside it. But they weren't needed anymore because they were built for the first flights to understand how the space shuttle worked. They weren't being maintained though. So of 181 sensors in the wing, only 55 had already failed. Now what this meant is when mission control started to get indication back from the shuttle, they started to see results that they didn't believe because they get false alarms on these things. But they were actually real alarms telling them that the space shuttle was burning up. It was too hot. So again, think about your facilities. Do you have equipment in your facilities that you don't use very much anymore? So it's not maintained or looked after very much. And people start to think it only gives you false alarms. That is a normalization of deviance problem in your facility. You start to ignore the false alarms. You don't do anything about the false alarm because you think it's false, but it's not. It might be a real alarm, and that is a problem. That is the issue that we start to see. There are many other examples of normalization of deviance that have occurred, and I'll quickly go through a couple more. I mentioned Challenger Space Shuttle already. So this is the one where the O-rings failed. Now, they knew that the O-rings became brittle at cold temperature, but they didn't know how consistently that happened. They didn't have the data. Without the information, they had to make decisions, so they assumed things were okay. They normalized that it should be okay. And what happened was the O-ring failed, the rocket exploded, and it killed those 7 astronauts as well. If we think about the Gretley coal mine disaster, this was a coal mine, an underground coal mine, and they were digging close to an abandoned mine. And that abandoned mine had been flooded. It was full of water. One day, because they assumed everything was okay and that they weren't anywhere near the flooded old mine, they broke through the wall and it flooded out through the mine they were working in, and it killed 4 people when that mine flooded. They assumed that because there was water leaking into the mine, that was just because the mine was always wet. There was always water. They normalized seeing water in the mine and didn't notice that it was a problem for them. The Texas City refinery explosion. Again, this is where they were overfilling the raffinate tower on startup. And they overfilled that raffinate tower every startup because they didn't want to trip out the pumps. And their experience told them if they didn't overfill it, the pumps tripped sometimes. They normalized overfilling the pump, overfilling the tower was normal, and that is how you started up. Sadly, in this instance, 15 workers were killed in the explosion after that tower overfilled, leaked out, and found an ignition source and exploded. If we think about the Macondo Blowout in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico, they had normalized that the abandonment activities were working okay. So they assumed when they were doing the cement job that it worked. But in fact, the cement job hadn't worked. They assumed that it had. The well then blew out. The blowout preventer failed to work. And 11 workers were killed in that incident, as well as the contamination in the Gulf of Mexico with the oil leaking for 87 days. Another coal mine example. So a little bit different. It's a coal mine. This was a coal mine in New Zealand. It was an underground coal mine. There was a lot of methane in this coal. Now, methane is explosive. The problem they had was the methane built up underground and then found an ignition source and exploded. When it exploded, 29 miners were killed in that explosion. The miners had started to bypass the methane alarms because the methane alarms kept going off and stopping the mining machines. So they wanted to keep mining. They were being pressured to keep mining. So they normalized that it was okay to turn off the methane detectors. They didn't detect that the methane was building up to such an extent that it could explode. And it caused that tragic, significant explosion. Another example of where people ignored the alarms because they assumed the alarms were all false is actually the Dupont Bell toxic chemical release that happened in 2010. So over a 2-day period, there had been 3 separate chemical releases at the facility, but they assumed that they were false alarms because they assumed the equipment was faulty because it had always been faulty in the past. So that 3rd release resulted in 1 worker dying due to that release of toxic chemicals. So assuming an alarm is false is a big problem that we need to try and avoid when we're working in our facilities. And the last example on this screen is from 2012, and it is a cruise ship. So this was a Costa Concordia that ran aground and then sunk close to islands. Now, the ship was deliberately sailing very close to the islands in what they call a high-speed sail-by. So it was to provide excitement for the people on land and for the people on the ship to sail close to the land very fast. But they should not have been doing it. It was not part of the procedure, but it was normalized. It was accepted. It was done every cruise. And that led to the captain thinking it was okay. Sadly, that ship sank and 32 lives were lost when that ship sank because the captain normalized a high-speed sail-by. So the fact is that normalization of deviance is a very dangerous thing that we can do. And as humans, we do it all the time. It's that little creeping change that we keep doing, and then we stop even noticing that we're doing it. So it might be that little bit going over the speed limit, just a little bit each time. You don't get caught, nothing happens. You keep doing it just a little bit each time. One day you might not be able to stop in time because you're a little bit over the speed limit. So the problem we've got is when we accept deviations from what we should be doing as normal, it prevents us from seeing the real issues. We lose the weak signals of something almost going wrong, but not quite. So what can we do? What can you do in your workplace to look out for these weak signals and make sure that you can focus on avoiding them? How do you make sure you don't normalize these changes? What can you do to prevent that. Some ideas are have a conversation with someone from a different part of your plant. Take them for a walk in your plant. What do they notice that you don't see anymore? Bringing in those fresh eyes of someone else is really useful to try and challenge what you're doing. If you're doing something that you think is correct, explain it to someone else that's not involved. Does it sound right to them, or do they think there might be a slight change to that as well? So they're just some examples of normalization of deviance. It's a complex area, but we just need to make sure we focus on looking for the small changes when they occur, so they don't just become normal and what we do every day. Thank you for your attention. I hope this was useful for you. I see that it is being recorded, so hopefully you'll be able to get access to it if you wish later. Please reach out to me or the Safety Centre on social media. We're happy to talk to you about how we may be able to help you or any issues that you may be having. So thank you very much. I will now see if we have any questions that have come in. Okay, I've got a question here. Where are we? Okay, so the emphasis is on weak signals and normalization of deviance. The examples you have noted are of large, well-established organizations. But if the culture on site is not safety driven due to commercial issues, how do you reverse that? Would small changes be sufficient? That is a very good question, and it comes down to how you deal with the culture on the site. I would suggest, even on a small site where money is difficult to get, the little tasks, as you mentioned, the small things that you do every day to just make sure you're looking at what's going on is very important. So have as I said, take someone with you on a walk on your site visit. They can walk through, what do they see? What can they notice? That is a really useful way for you to focus on what is in front of your eyes that you don't see anymore. And the other thing is for you to practice each day the little things that you do to make sure you do your job right. So whether it is checking something that you're doing, whether it is when you walk through the facility, you clean up and make sure there's no rubbish, those sorts of things. That's a good way to try and keep your mind focused on it. Another question here, what about the causes of Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island and Bhopal? Yes, they all had normalization of deviance associated with them as well. It pretty much, it occurs in many, many incidents all over the world. They are usual, it usually is part of the incident that occurs in many ways. Just looking through some of the other questions. I can't see any other questions yet that have come through. So I might pass back to Mr. Yakub. Question, hang on. Can you connect the topic with human factors engineering, and can you brief about the new trends in process safety, big data, AI analytics, dynamic risk studies using mathematical models? That is a very big question with lots of parts to it. Normalization of deviance is part of human factors management. So you do need to focus on human factors management, and that will help you deal with normalization of deviance in your facility. In terms of the new trend, big data is very significant. It is emerging. There is a lot of potential for it to be very good into the future, but I think we still have a lot of work to do to get it right yet. AI, or artificial intelligence, again, artificial intelligence does not remove human factors issues because we don't yet have true artificial intelligence that can design and build itself. A human is still designing it and building it and programming it and maintaining it. So artificial intelligence is useful in some areas, but it doesn't eliminate the human. and dynamic risk assessments. There is a lot of work going on there, particularly in some of the mathematical models. I know that the Texas A&M University have been doing some work, I believe, with ExxonMobil in Doha on that particular topic. So, as well as some of their work in Texas. So there's a lot of activity happening in that area. One last question. Can you please comment on the common problem with almost all safety incidents, which is how to change the culture, behavior of the people? The key thing to do here is you have to have your leaders engaged to want to change the culture in the organization, because people will follow their leaders. So I think the short answer is for you to focus on making sure your leaders want the change, because they can lead the change from the top. It's very hard to change the culture from the bottom only. You need the top as well. So I might leave it there, Mr. Yaqub, and hand back to you. Thank you.